I wanted to talk for a few minutes about synthesis. And this lecture isn't going to be just about your academic synthesis essay, although obviously it will apply to that, but really it's going to approach the concept of synthesis in a more general way. And the reason I want to approach it that way is that synthesis is one of the most basic activities you do in academic writing. In other words, it's not just the kind of thing you'll do in this class or even other English classes, but almost any college level course that asks you to write about sources is really asking you to synthesize those sources. So we have to figure out, what does synthesis mean and how does it work? I think the best way to get started thinking about synthesis is to look at the word itself. It's a Greek word. It comes from Greek roots. And the prefix there, syn, S-Y-N, means together in Greek. The root word thesis should be a word that you're familiar with, both from this class and from other writing classes. But thesis in Greek means idea. So synthesis is the act of bringing ideas together. Or more specifically, it's the act of bringing sources together, finding ideas in multiple sources, highlighting the connections between those ideas, and helping the reader think about how the ideas in the various sources relate to each other. Now at this point you might be thinking, okay, that sounds great, but how does synthesis work? In other words, how do you do it? And I guess unfortunately, maybe, the first step in any synthesis project is always careful reading of the sources. You'll need to read the source carefully enough to understand not just the overall argument that the source is making, in other words, not just the main idea, not just the soundbite, but rather specifically what points are being raised, how do those points relate to the argument the author is making, and then even on another level, how is the source making its points? What kinds of examples are being used? Why are those kinds of examples being chosen? What kinds of words are used? What kinds of tone? So being able to think about what we might call rhetorical techniques in the source is also important to understanding how two sources relate to each other. Now, when you have multiple sources, it's not enough just to read each source individually and think carefully about the points in each source. You also have to be able to make comparisons between the sources. So as you're reading, especially once you've read the first source and you're looking at the second one, you need to be looking specifically for connections between the sources. And that means, first of all, you have to get them in the same ballpark. You have to get them in the same neighborhood. How do these sources relate on some general idea? And hopefully your sources are already dealing with a similar topic in some way. But then you have to ask yourself, what do these sources have to do with each other? Do they agree on this topic, on this argument? Do they agree entirely, or do they agree on certain points? Do they disagree on certain points? Are there ways in which the ideas of one source are contradicted by the ideas in another source? Or more commonly, is the relationship between them more complex than just simple agreement or disagreement? Usually, the way sources relate to each other is not quite as simple as outright agreement or disagreement. Instead, you'll see something like the yes-but relationship. In other words, they may agree on the general point being argued, but they may disagree on the reasons leading up to that point. Or they may agree with each other in terms of the problem, but they may disagree in terms of how to best solve the problem. Or they may disagree on some of the individual points, but nevertheless reach the same conclusion. In other words, when you're talking about multiple sources dealing with the same issue, try not to think of them as pro and con, as being on one side or the other side of the issue. I know our political discourse often leads us to think of issues as having just these two approaches, and either you agree entirely with one side or you agree entirely with the other side. But in fact, most arguments are a little more complex than that. In other words, the differences between the two arguments may be more subtle than you're expecting. So you have to read carefully enough that you can think about specifically how these sources relate. You might also think about how successful the two articles are. One other way of making comparisons between articles is to make comparisons regarding their strengths and weaknesses. So you may find that two articles are taking similar positions, but one may make a much stronger argument than the other one. And so you can talk about that relationship as well if you like. You should also ask questions about the sources as you're reading them. It's a good idea when you're preparing for a synthesis essay to take notes about the sources that you're reading with any questions you have about the points that they're making. Anything that strikes you as unusual, or on the other hand, anything that strikes you as particularly interesting or a particularly good point. Make sure you make note of it so that you can respond to that in the paper itself. And once you've read the sources carefully and considered the different connections between them, you need to get them into the paper. Now, I can't tell you how to get the sources into the paper exactly. In other words, I don't know what you're going to do at the beginning of the paper, in the second paragraph, etc. Certainly, I don't know it for all of the range of synthesis essays you might write. But even for this essay, what you do with these sources, the way you connect them, is going to be individual to your own reading. But I will say, in general, there are three ways to get source material into your paper, and we've talked a little bit about these already. You can quote the material directly, and remember, if you quote it directly, you should make sure to quote it exactly. Don't make any changes to the quotation. Or you can paraphrase the material. And again, as we've talked about, it's really important to remember that paraphrasing isn't just making changes to the words of the source. Rather, it's taking the information or ideas from the source and expressing it in your own words. In other words, telling the reader what the source is talking about. Or you can summarize the source. Now, and really that's not a separate activity if you think about it technically. Summarizing is very, very much like paraphrasing. It's just paraphrasing and making it shorter at the same time. But I highlight summary as an option because you may not want to just paraphrase a particular sentence in the source when you're talking about a particular point. Rather, you may be covering a whole section of that article, whether it's a paragraph or multiple paragraphs, putting it together as one point that you want to talk about briefly. But remember, you're not just bringing in information from these articles for the sake of bringing in the information. The point is to engage with the articles in some way. In other words, the point is to help the reader understand what these articles are saying. So what you need to do, first of all, is make sure that you're discussing the articles as you go. When you present information from the articles, when you present a specific point, for example, then you want to talk about what that point means or why that point is interesting. You need to comment in some way so the reader feels like they're being guided through the ideas of the article. And then once you have information from more than one article, more than one source in your paper, you need to talk about the connections between them. Sometimes you'll hear English teachers say that you need to make your sources speak to one another. And what that means is you need to engage those sources in conversation by highlighting the connections between them. All those comparisons that you made between the sources while you were reading them, now's the time for you to discuss them. So you can look at an example like the one I provided here, where you can see a student bringing in information from two different sources, talking about that information, and talking about the connections between the information. So in this paragraph we have, while Robert Ferguson, professor at Columbia University, argues that Lincoln's speeches have lasting value based on the credibility of the speaker, Andrew Hansen, Georgia State University assistant professor, argues that Lincoln's second inaugural speaks to individuals today on a more personal level. So you can see there that the author has brought in two different sources, Ferguson on the one hand and Hansen on the other hand, has figured out what these sources have to do with each other. It's not that these two sources are completely disagreeing, but they might disagree on an interpretation of what Lincoln is doing. Now, the author hasn't stopped by introducing the information, though. The author's continued by commenting on specifically Hansen's information. So we have, which means that each reader and era endows the speech with its cultural, rhetorical, and political value. There we see the author interpreting Hansen's ideas for the reader, helping the reader understand what Hansen's saying and how Hansen's ideas relate to Ferguson's ideas. The author goes on by bringing in more information from Hansen, a specific example. For example, in the article, etc., Hansen says, there are, however, those speeches like the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural that practice their persuasion on audiences beyond the immediate exigency. They persist, they talk to us still, and their agency endures. So this is a way of circling back to what Hansen's saying by providing a specific example. And then the author goes on to comment on the connection between the sources in general by saying, although both arguments have value, better use of the rhetoric of Lincoln's speeches comes from a combination of understanding the times in which they were said and an analysis of why that makes his words applicable today. And that last sentence is really important because what we see in that sentence is the author, the student, finding his or her own role in the conversation by saying, sort of, here's what I think about this disagreement. Ferguson says this, Hansen says that. Now let me explain to you how I think we should think about both of these ideas by saying, well, it's kind of both. We can understand the speeches best if we first understand the times in which they were said, and we look at why the words are still applicable today. Now, I've highlighted the sentences in this paragraph with different colors to sort of show you visually what the student's doing. He starts by introducing Ferguson's ideas, that's highlighted in red, and then introducing Hansen's ideas, highlighted in purple. We can see two different sources being discussed. The green sections, both the end of that first sentence and the third sentence in this section, are examples of the student, the author of the paper, finding his or her own voice. In other words, either explaining what these sources are saying in his or her own words, or commenting in some way on the connection between them, and that's what's happening at the end of the paragraph. Now, this isn't a model for synthesis. There's no one right way to introduce sources. Sometimes you might talk about one source for a whole paragraph, and then you might talk about another source for a whole paragraph. What I'm trying to show you is that you need to be able to bring the sources together somehow, whether it's paragraph by paragraph, sentence by sentence, or sometimes, as we see in this example, parts of a sentence from multiple sources. So in this first sentence we have Ferguson, then Hansen, then the student, all talking at once. And so we have a sort of a conversation going on between these three different speakers in the paper. Now, before I finish up, I want to hit a couple of mechanical points. These are the details of synthesis, not sort of the concepts, but sort of how it works, the mechanics of it. First of all, you need to understand how to introduce a source. In academic writing, there are certain conventions about talking about sources. So the first time you use a source in a paper, you should identify that source as fully as possible. And usually that means the author's whole name, and often the name of the article or book or website that the author has written. So you might say something like, in Rob Jenkins' article, Why Are So Many Students Still Failing Online?, Jenkins argues that, and then you'd continue by introducing his argument in some way. After that first use of Jenkins' ideas, though, you can simply refer to it as Jenkins. You don't have to keep using his full name or the title of the article after that first usage. Here's just a convention of academic writing. We do normally refer to authors by last name, not by first name. We've talked about the fact that academic writing is more formal and less personal than other kinds of writing, and this is simply one more example of that. So after the first usage, first time call him Rob Jenkins, after that refer to him as Jenkins or the author or something like that. It's also important to use strong connecting words when you're making the connections between the sources, when you're talking about the relationships between the sources. You want the reader to understand how these sources stand in relation to each other. So when you bring in a second source to refer to the first one, you want to say things like similarly or in the same way or furthermore, if the sources are saying something similar, obviously, or phrases like on the other hand, or however, or in contrast, if the sources are disagreeing in some way or saying different things. The idea here is that these phrases help the reader understand what relationship you're trying to establish between the sources. You also need to think about citing your sources fully. I've got a whole separate lecture on MLA citation style that you'll be watching or listening to also this unit, so I won't cover that here. But in general, try to keep in mind that you need to be clear with your readers about where the ideas and the words are coming from. Remember, if you're using the exact words of the source, you must put them in quotation marks. Even if you're taking part of a sentence, not even a whole sentence, from the source, you have to put those words in quotation marks. Otherwise, you're suggesting that you wrote those words, which is, of course, a form of plagiarism. All right, there's been a lot of information here, and synthesis is, I think, a difficult topic conceptually, mainly because it's going to be very different from paper to paper. The connections that you make between sources, first of all, is going to depend upon the specific sources you're using. But also, even if you and another student were using the exact same two sources, you still might interpret the connections between those sources in very different ways. So we have to think about synthesis as a process and an approach to writing more than a particular kind of assignment or even a specific activity that you engage in writing. The bottom line here is that when you're engaging in synthesis, or really when you're using multiple sources in a paper in any context, first you need to make sure that you're reading carefully and critically, and you need to make sure that you're thinking about the ideas in the sources and how they relate to one another. Remember that in this paper, you are the guide. You're helping the reader sort of walk through the area that's created by these two sources or these multiple sources. You've got multiple ideas. Often those ideas are complicated. Often the relationships between them are complex or subtle or difficult to spot. So your job in the paper is to help the reader understand what these sources are saying, how they relate to each other, and also how to think about those sources. That's your role in the conversation that we've talked about already. Don't make a synthesis paper into simply a summary of multiple sources. You have to do more than just summarize what two sources say. You have to be able to talk about how they connect to each other and give the reader some better understanding of the idea and of the sources that you're looking at. If you have any questions about synthesis or about the academic synthesis essay, let me know. Thanks.